The morning came soft over Natchez, light bending through the moss that hung like old curtains from the oaks. The air was damp, and the fields shimmered with dew, but there was no peace in it. Every dawn carried the same rhythm: the horn, the shuffle of bare feet, the start of another day that belonged to someone else. From the big house came the faint ring of a bell, sharp and cold, as if the sun itself waited on the master's table. In the kitchen, Clara moved before the light had broken fully. Her hands were sure, steady, though they carried the weight of years of work. She was known as the best cook the plantation ever had, trusted with the family's meals, praised even by guests who never thought to thank her by name. She listened without expression when they called her the woman or the cook, though her name had always been Clara. Her back was straight, her hair wrapped in a cloth that kept the smoke from tangling in it, and her eyes, quiet and dark, missed nothing. The house around her was waking. Servants carried water to the bedrooms upstairs, the children of Colonel Barrow rattled down the halls, and Mistress Eleanor's voice floated sharp as a whip through the stairwell, reminding everyone to be quick for prayers. Clara stirred a pot of cornmeal, watched the grains swell, and placed a pan of biscuits by the fire. She moved without sound, as though the kitchen itself breathed with her, every motion learned through years of rising before daylight. Beyond the house, the plantation spread wide and heavy. Cotton stretched into the horizon, rose straight as scars in the earth. In the quarters, children with swollen bellies cried for food while their mothers pulled on worn dresses. Jonah, bent with age, lifted a hoe with hands cracked and trembling. He paused to catch his breath, eyes fixed on the distant house, as though measuring how far his life had been spent walking between the fields and the overseer's lash. Clara did not let her face show grief, though it rested always in her chest. The night before, she had dreamed of her daughters, the two little girls she once carried on her hip, who used to play in the dust of the yard. She dreamed of them laughing, and when she woke, she reached for them only to touch the hard wood of her pallet. They had been taken to the auction block months ago, sold to strangers who would carry them downriver, and she had been given no word since. Still, she rose, washed her face, tied her cloth, and set her hands to the fire, because the master's family must eat. Colonel Barrow came down late, boots polished, coat snug across his belly, every step a reminder of his power. He passed through the kitchen only long enough to say, "Smells fine today, Clara," as if praise were coin enough to buy back all she had lost. Mistress Eleanor followed, lips pressed tight, her eyes searching Clara for signs of disrespect. She believed God had ordained the world in its order, white above black, master above slave, man above woman, and she recited that order daily at her table. The children, loud and careless, snatched at biscuits and laughed with mouths full, never glancing at the woman who had baked them. Clara served them all with hands that did not tremble. Her eyes never lingered on their faces, never showed what sat inside her. She ladled grits, laid out bacon, poured milk, and stood back against the wall while they bowed their heads for prayer. The mistress thanked God for bounty, for order, for the safety of their household. Clara's lips did not move. Outside, the sun lifted higher, and the fields shone white with cotton, waiting for hands already broken to strip it clean. Overseers barked orders, whips cracked, and voices rose in tired hymns that slipped like smoke through the rows. In the quarters, the people worked and bent and sweated, their backs burning under the same sky that gilded the columns of the big house. Through it all, Clara remained in the kitchen, the heart of the household, where she stirred, chopped, baked, and tasted. Her world was fire, iron, and knife, the smells of onions and smoke and grease clinging to her skin. She knew which herbs healed and which burned, which roots soothed and which destroyed. She had learned it long ago from her mother, who whispered recipes in the dark and warned which leaves to never touch with a careless hand. Clara had remembered every word. She moved through the day with silence, but inside her was a quiet storm. Every dish she set on the table reminded her that she had nothing left that was her own, not even her children's laughter. Every prayer from the mistress's lips rang against her ribs like a stone in an empty jar. She swallowed it down, as she always had, because the day gave her no choice. And yet, When the light slanted toward evening and the house grew still, she stepped outside for a breath of air. The swamp edge called to her with its thick green shadows. She stood at its rim, eyes on the plants that thrived in the damp soil, their shapes both familiar and strange. She knew which ones cooled a fever, which ones stopped a cough. She knew, too, which ones never healed, which ones carried silence in their leaves. The air was heavy, the cicadas loud, and the moss swayed like veils in a church. Clara stood there a long time, her hands folded, her face unreadable, as though she listened to something no one else could hear. Then she turned back to the kitchen, where the fire waited, and the family bell rang once more, calling her to serve. The days rolled on with the same rhythm, each one heavy as stone. Clara rose before the light, stoked the fire, and filled the house with the smell of bread and smoke. Her body worked with the same steady pace, but her heart carried an emptiness that gnawed like hunger. She had seen loss before, but nothing hollowed her like the silence her daughters left behind. Their voices had once filled the kitchen, soft laughter at her skirts, the quick patter of feet across the dirt floor. Now only the scrape of her spoon and the hiss of boiling pots answered her. Word had spread through the quarters that a trader had carried them away, downriver toward New Orleans, where the markets were wide and cruel. Clara had no letters, no way to trace them, only a picture in her mind of their small hands lifted as they were pulled from her grasp. The memory pressed against her ribs until she could hardly breathe. At night she lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for the sound of their voices that never came. Mistress Eleanor noticed the quiet in her eyes and snapped at her for it. "A good servant smiles," she said, voice sharp as vinegar. "The Lord loves a cheerful heart." Clara kept her head bowed and her lips closed. She did not tell her mistress that her heart had been buried with her children, that cheerfulness was a mask she could no longer lift. In the yard, the overseer's whip cracked against the back of Jonah, who had taken a crust of bread to still his hunger. His body bent but did not break, though blood shone against his shirt. The others kept their eyes down, hands busy in the rows, while his cries spread like fire through the field. Clara heard the sound from the kitchen and did not flinch. Pain was so constant it had become part of the air itself. When evening came, Clara walked slowly past the quarters, where the people gathered close around small fires. Children sat on their mothers' laps, their eyes wide and hollow, bellies swollen with hunger. Old voices lifted in song, low and trembling, hymns carried from memory across oceans. The words were heavy with sorrow, yet they rose like smoke to the stars, as if calling for a freedom none could yet see. Clara stood in the shadows and listened, her face still, her throat tight. The swamp pressed close to the edge of the fields, its damp breath curling around the quarters. Clara's eyes lingered on its tangle of vines and blossoms, plants whose secrets she had learned long ago. She remembered her mother's voice, teaching her to crush leaves for poultices, to draw fever from the skin, to calm the cough that rattled in a child's chest. She remembered, too, the whispered warnings, the herbs never to touch unless she wished to bring death into her hands. Those names lived in her like a hidden tongue, sharp and dangerous. One night, unable to sleep, Clara slipped out beneath the moon. The air was thick, the ground soft beneath her feet. She moved quietly, as if the night itself might catch her. At the swamp's edge, she bent to touch the plants she knew by heart. Their leaves glistened with dew, their roots buried deep in the wet earth. She traced them with her fingers, the knowledge of their power stirring in her mind. Healing and harm lived side by side in those shadows, waiting for the hand that would decide their use. She straightened, the moonlight brushing her face, and for a moment she felt the storm inside her shift. Grief weighed heavy, but beneath it something darker stirred, something sharp and restless. She turned back toward the quarters, her eyes fixed ahead, her steps steady. The song still floated on the air, voices worn but unbroken, holding tight to hope even in chains. Clara listened once more, then stepped into the dark, her heart pressed silent against her chest. Morning returned, bright and pitiless. Clara's hands moved as they always did, chopping onions, stirring pots, placing bread to rise. She listened without listening as the mistress scolded, as the children quarreled, as the colonel boasted of debts and deals at the table. Her face gave nothing away, but inside, her grief spread like roots through soil, pushing deeper, seeking a place to grow. Each word she heard, each lash that cracked in the field, each prayer said over food she had cooked, pressed heavier on her. The emptiness was filling with something else, though she could not yet name it. The sun sank again, and Clara stood by the kitchen door, the smell of smoke and grease clinging to her. She looked toward the swamp, where shadows thickened and secrets waited. Her heart beat slow and heavy, and her eyes, steady as stone, did not turn away. The air grew hotter with each passing day, heavy enough to press the breath from the chest. Cotton swelled white in the fields, and the overseers drove the people harder, shouting until their throats cracked. Clara kept to the kitchen, but every sound carried to her: the whip, the cries, the dull weight of feet dragging through dust. She moved with calm, her face still, yet inside her the storm deepened. One afternoon she heard voices drifting from the study, the colonel's thick with drink, another man's sharp and worried. She leaned closer to the door, though her hands never paused in their work. She heard debts spoken plain, harvests too thin, payments due. Then came the words that stopped her heart. More slaves would be sold, children among them. Clara gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. She knew the sound of despair when it fell from a man's lips, for she had felt it herself. It was the same sound she made when her daughters were torn away. She returned to the kitchen, stirring a pot though her mind had slipped far from the fire. The world blurred, and all she could see was the block, the children lined like cattle, the hands that reached but could not hold. A great emptiness opened inside her, but in its center grew a flame. It did not flicker like grief. It burned steady, hard, clear. For the first time since her daughters were taken, she felt something sharper than sorrow. That night she sat in the shadows outside the quarters. Jonah shuffled toward her, his back bent, his face creased like old bark. He lowered himself beside her with a groan and whispered, asking what stirred behind her eyes. She looked at him long before she answered. Her voice was low, even, like stone dropped in a well. She said there would come a day when the master's table would be broken. Jonah's eyes widened. He shook his head slow, warning her that such paths ended only in blood. There's more than his. Clara did not argue. She only said, then let it end. Days passed, but her heart no longer beat with the same rhythm. She measured her time not by the bell or the sun, but by the steps that drew her closer to a decision. She carried water with the others, moved through the kitchen with the same calm, but her eyes were fixed on some point beyond the walls. Even Sarah, young and eager, saw it. The girl asked if she was ill. Clara only smoothed her hair and told her to keep quiet. At night she lay awake, the ceiling low above her, listening to the chorus of crickets. She thought of her daughters, their small fingers reaching, their voices calling her name. She thought of Jonah's warning, of his weary faith that time would heal nothing. She thought of the swamp, of the leaves that waited, of the secrets she carried in her hands. The fire in her grew hotter. Grief had hollowed her, but now rage filled the empty space, settling deep as bone. Each prayer the mistress spoke before supper struck her like a hammer. Each laugh of the colonel's children rang against her ribs until she wanted to scream. She kept her silence, but inside her heart she began to shape a choice. The house smelled always of smoke and grease, of sugar and coffee, of roasted meat that filled the mouths of those who had never missed a meal. Clara moved among it all, but her mind wandered to the swamp. She pictured the plants, their dark leaves glistening, their roots heavy with promise. Healing and harm lived side by side, and she alone carried the power to decide which path to take. When she passed Jonah again, he caught her sleeve, begged her with tired eyes not to carry fire into her own hands. She looked at him and said nothing. She only pulled free and walked on. The songs rose that night, voices worn but unbroken, but Clara did not join. She sat apart, her face to the sky, her jaw set firm. By dawn her choice was clear. The bell rang, the house stirred, the day began as all others had. But Clara's heart no longer bent under grief alone. She had found a place beyond sorrow, a place where pain turned sharp and unyielding. The world around her had given no mercy, and she would give none back. She stood at the kitchen fire, her hands steady as ever, but her eyes were dark with something new. The colonel boasted of profits to come. The mistress prayed her prayers. The children laughed without thought. Clara listened in silence. Beneath her calm, the flame inside her burned bright, and for the first time she did not push it down. The breaking point had come, and Clara knew she could not return to the woman she had been. Night held the land close, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. Clara moved through the dark with steps soft as breath, her eyes fixed on the shadows where the swamp waited. The trees leaned over her, their branches dripping with moss that brushed against her shoulders. The moon hung pale above, casting a silver sheen over water still as glass. Frogs croaked low, insects hummed, and every sound seemed louder than it should, as if the world itself listened. She bent at the edge of the swamp and touched the ground, cool and wet beneath her fingers. The plants she had known since girlhood grew thick, their leaves broad, their roots hidden deep. Her mother's voice stirred in her memory, guiding her hand. This one to ease pain, this one to heal wounds, this one to never touch unless the heart wished for silence. Clara's hand hovered, then settled, pulling carefully at stems that shone slick with dew. She moved slow, gathering just enough, never rushing, her breath steady. Back in the kitchen, the fire low and the house silent, Clara laid her harvest on the table. She crushed leaves between stone and wood, ground roots until they turned to powder, boiled stems until the water darkened. The smell rose sharp, bitter, clinging to her skin. She worked with a calm that felt almost holy, as though she followed a ritual older than the house itself. Each motion carried purpose. Her grief sharpened into the rhythm of pestle and mortar, of knife against stem. She tested a pinch of the powder in the corner of the yard, leaving it where the rats prowled. By morning one lay stiff, its body curled in the dust. She stared at it without flinching, her jaw tight. Proof lay before her that the swamp's secrets were true. Sarah found her once, standing over a pot that simmered low. The girl's eyes grew wide, her voice trembling as she asked what Clara brewed. Clara set her hand gently on Sarah's head and told her it was nothing she need speak of. The child's lips pressed shut, fear and loyalty binding them. Clara watched her slip away into the dark, then turned back to her work. Jonah came another night, his shadow long in the doorway. He saw the jars lined on the shelf, the powders sealed in cloth, the dark liquid glinting in the light of the fire. His face folded into sorrow. He whispered that vengeance had a cost no heart could bear, that fire burned even the hand that struck the match. Clara did not look away. She told him her heart had already been burned when her children were taken, and what remained could not be hurt more than it already had. Jonah's shoulders sagged, but he said no more. The days passed as they always did, but Clara carried her secret close. She stirred stews, baked bread, poured milk, and no one saw that her hands bore the memory of leaves crushed to dust. The mistress scolded, the colonel boasted, the children laughed, and still Clara's face remained calm, though her eyes were darker than before. At night she returned to the swamp, gathering what she needed, her steps steady, her mind clear. She worked until the mixture was ready, sealed in jars, hidden where no one would think to look. Each time she lifted a spoon to stir a pot for the household, she thought of the jars waiting, patient as she was. The storm inside her no longer raged wild. It had settled into something colder, sharper, like steel drawn thin. She felt the weight of what she carried, yet she did not tremble. She had known sorrow, and she had known hunger, and she had known silence. Now she knew purpose. When the house grew quiet, when even the overseers had fallen into sleep, Clara sat by the dying fire and held the jar in her lap. The liquid inside shone dark, almost black, catching what little light the flames gave. She traced the glass with her fingers, her face unreadable. Somewhere in the quarters, a hymn rose, voices soft, calling on hope that seemed far away. Clara listened until the song faded, then set the jar back in its place. Her eyes lingered on it, steady, certain. The gathering was done. The choice had been made. The day of the feast came with the weight of thunder in the air, though no storm showed in the sky. The house was dressed in its finest. Candles stood ready in silver holders, their wicks trimmed, their wax waiting to melt. The table stretched long beneath the chandelier, covered in linen white as bone, polished plates and shining goblets laid in perfect order. Neighbors from miles around were expected, men who owned fields and men who owed debts, women who whispered prayers as they judged the cut of each other's dresses. The Barrow household moved with a rush of servants carrying trays, polishing glass, fetching wood for the fire that must not falter. Clara worked at the center of it all, calm as a stone in the river. She chopped and stirred, baked and basted, her hands steady, her face unreadable. She moved among pots and pans like a figure in a dance, every step rehearsed by years of labor. Yet beneath her calm the jar waited, hidden, its contents dark as night, patient in its silence. As the guests arrived, the house filled with laughter and the scrape of boots across polished floors. Perfumed women brushed past Clara without glance, their hands weighed down by rings. Men slapped each other's shoulders and spoke of crops and markets, their words thick with pride and greed. The colonel's voice rose above them all, hearty and sure, a man who believed his table showed proof of his power. Clara carried platters into the dining room, the weight balanced on her arms. She set roasted meat before them, bowls of stew, baskets of bread warm from the oven. She poured wine, refilled cups, moved with a grace none noticed. Her eyes flicked to Jonah once, standing at the edge of the room with the other servants. His gaze met hers for a heartbeat, a shadow of warning in it, but she turned away without faltering. The mistress called for prayer. Heads bowed, hands folded, voices joined in thanks to God for abundance, for family, for the safety of their house. Clara stood apart, her head lowered but her lips still. The words slid past her, hollow as wind through dry branches. When the prayer ended, laughter rose again, louder, the sound of knives striking plates, the scrape of spoons in bowls. Clara ladled stew with a steady hand, filling each dish, her movements slow and deliberate. The rich smell rose, thick and savory, covering the bitter trace no one else could sense. Plates passed from hand to hand, and soon the meal was alive with chatter, with chewing, with the clink of glass on glass. She stood by the doorway, her apron neat, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The room seemed to pulse with sound, yet to Clara it came muffled, as though she stood beneath water. She watched forks lift, spoons dip, lips smile. She heard a burst of laughter from one of the colonel's guests, saw a child lick butter from his fingers. Her face did not move. The first cough came soft, almost hidden by talk. Then another, harsher. A man pressed a napkin to his lips, his brow furrowing. A woman's hand shook as she set down her glass, her face paling. The colonel frowned, shifting in his seat, then reached for his throat. Silence rippled through the room as bodies stiffened, voices faltered, laughter died. The coughing grew louder, chairs scraped, spoons clattered to the floor. Someone retched, the sound sharp against the hush. A goblet tipped, spilling red wine across the white cloth, spreading like a wound. Panic rose, sudden and wild, as one by one they clutched their bellies, gasped for breath, staggered from their chairs. Screams filled the air, mingled with prayers, curses, the scrape of boots against wood as guests stumbled and fell. Clara did not move. She stood with her hands folded against her apron, her eyes calm, watching the storm she had summoned break across the room. The colonel fell forward onto his plate, his wine glass shattering beside him. The mistress shrieked, her voice high and raw, before collapsing with her arms stretched across the table. The children's cries rang sharp, piercing through the chaos, then faltered into silence. Jonah pressed himself against the wall, his face gray, his lips moving in prayer. Sarah hid her face in her hands, trembling as the room dissolved into ruin. The candles flickered, shadows leaping across the walls, the tablecloth soaked in a mixture of wine and bile. Guests clawed at their throats, eyes wide, bodies twisting before they crumpled. The sound grew strange, a mix of groans and crashes, the scrape of chairs overturned, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Clara's breath came slow and even. She looked across the room, not at faces but at the whole of it. The table that had long been a place of her servitude now turned into an altar of her choice. When the noise began to fade, when only moans and whispers lingered, Clara turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Her steps were steady, her back straight, her face as calm as when she had risen that morning. The fire still burned in the hearth, pots still simmered, bread still cooled on the table. She stood among them, her apron stained, her hands folded, the silence pressing close around her. The supper was finished. The house did not fall silent at once. For a time it echoed with groans, the scrape of boots, the soft thud of bodies that could no longer rise. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. The voices that had once filled the air with laughter now dragged low, broken, fading one by one. The smell of roasted meat lingered, but beneath it came another scent, sharp and sour, the odor of sickness. The candles still burned steady on the long table, their flames bright over faces twisted in fear. Jonah stumbled past the threshold, his hands shaking as he clutched at the frame. His eyes found Clara, and in them was not anger but sorrow too deep to name. He whispered her name as if it might call her back from the edge. She did not answer. He pressed his lips together, turned, and vanished into the dark beyond the porch, his shadow stretching thin across the yard. Sarah remained near the corner, her small frame pressed against the wall. She trembled, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and wet. Clara crossed to her slowly, the hem of her dress brushing against the floorboards. She touched the girl's shoulder, gentle, steady. Sarah flinched but did not run. Clara leaned close, her voice low, telling her she must stay quiet, telling her the world had changed and would not change back. Sarah nodded, her breath shallow, her face streaked with tears. In the dining room the cries thinned until only silence held. The colonel lay slumped forward, his cheek against the table, his hand open beside a knife he could not lift. The mistress's body stretched across her chair, her hair loose, her lips parted. Around them, their guests sprawled in unnatural shapes, dresses stained, coats rumpled, hands clenched. The long table, once a symbol of pride, now bore witness to ruin. Clara moved among the bodies without sound. She looked down at each face, not with triumph, but with a calm that seemed carved from stone. These were the people who had feasted while others starved, who had prayed for blessings while selling children to strangers. Now their voices were gone, their laughter ended. She touched nothing, only walked the length of the room, then turned back toward the kitchen where the fire smoldered low. The night grew long. Outside, the fields stretched quiet beneath the stars, but the quarters stirred with unease. The enslaved had heard the cries from the house, the sudden clamor, the sharp silence that followed. They whispered among themselves, fear and wonder tangled in their voices. No one came near, not yet. The great house loomed against the sky like a shadow with eyes, its windows glowing faint with candlelight, its halls filled with stillness. Clara washed her hands at the basin, the water clouding dark, then clear again. She wiped her apron, though the stains remained. She sat at the table, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the dying fire. She felt the weight of what she had done, not like a burden, but like a stone long carried finally set down. Her chest rose and fell with slow breaths, her face unreadable. Toward dawn the house stood silent, its doors hanging open, its rooms heavy with the scent of death. Birds began to call, the sky shifting pale. Clara did not sleep. She moved through the rooms once more, closing shutters, snuffing candles, her steps measured. She did not look away from the ruin she had wrought. Each body was a mark against her, but each was also a measure against the grief she had been forced to bear. When the sun broke over the horizon, the yard brightened, the fields lit gold. The people in the quarters watched from a distance, their eyes wide, their hands clutching one another. They did not yet know the truth, only that the house had fallen quiet, that something had shifted in the order that bound them. Clara stepped onto the porch, the morning light catching her face. She did not speak. She stood a moment, her eyes on the fields, on the swamp beyond, on the sky stretching endless above. The air carried no sound but birdsong. She turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The house belonged to silence now. The silence of the house did not last. By the second day, riders came from neighboring estates, drawn by whispers carried through the fields. They found the doors ajar, the curtains drawn, the air inside heavy and foul. The table still stood covered in its white cloth, now stained with dark streaks, plates overturned, goblets dry. Bodies lay where they had fallen, faces stiff, hands curled. The riders recoiled, pulling scarves over their mouths, their boots clattering on the floorboards as they hurried through the rooms. Fear spread among them like fire in dry grass. They muttered of curses, of rebellion, of vengeance rising from those long kept silent. Word traveled fast across Natchez. The death of a family, the ruin of a house, the end of a name once spoken with pride. Men with rifles gathered, their coats buttoned tight, their eyes sharp. They spoke of order, of punishment, of the need to strike before the story grew too large. The enslaved from the quarters were herded into the yard, lined in rows, their faces pale with fear. Whips cracked against the dirt as overseers shouted for names. Voices shook, some swore ignorance, others whispered prayers, but no answer satisfied those who had come searching. Clara did not run. She stood on the porch when the riders arrived, her back straight, her hands at her sides. The sun caught the lines of her face, the set of her jaw, the stillness in her eyes. She did not fight when they seized her, their grips rough, their shouts sharp. She looked at them as though they were no more than shadows passing. When they demanded confession, she spoke without tremor. The supper was hers, the choice was hers, the deaths were hers. The words fell from her lips steady as stones. Gasps rose among the gathered, some in horror, some in awe. The men spat curses, calling her a monster, a witch, a devil's handmaid. But others looked away, unable to meet her eyes, for in them burned no madness but a calm that unsettled. The colonel's neighbors pressed for swift justice. They would not allow such defiance to stand. The law was called, though law in those days bent always to the will of those with land and guns. In the days that followed, Clara was held in a small room with walls of rough plank. A single window let in a strip of light that shifted with the sun. Chains bound her wrists, though she did not strain against them. She sat on the floor, her back to the wall, her eyes closed much of the time. Sarah came once, slipping through when no guard watched. The child clung to her, tears running down her face, begging her to say it was not true, begging her to repent so that mercy might find her. Clara lifted her hands as far as the chains allowed and touched the girl's cheek. She said no word of denial, only told her to remember, to live, to keep her voice even when the world tried to silence it. Sarah sobbed until she was pulled away, her cries echoing down the hall. Jonah did not escape suspicion. He had been seen near the house, had spoken too often of freedom. He was dragged before the crowd, his body already frail, his voice hoarse. He swore he had begged Clara not to act, that he had no part in her plan, but mercy was not in their hearts. They hanged him beneath the oak at the edge of the field, his shadow swaying against the ground. Those in the quarters watched from a distance, their faces carved in grief, their voices stilled. Clara heard the news with her eyes closed, her breath steady. She whispered his name once, then fell silent again. The trial was no more than a performance. Men in coats read from papers, their words loud but empty. Witnesses spoke of bodies sprawled on the floor, of a feast turned nightmare. They pointed to Clara, saying she had stood calm among the dead, that she had spoken without fear. She did not defend herself, did not plead. When asked if she wished to say anything, she raised her head and told them plain. They had taken her children, and she had taken theirs. The court fell quiet, the words echoing in the hall, heavy as iron. Sentence was passed swiftly. Death by hanging, to be carried out in the square where all could see. The men nodded, their order restored, their pride bound together by the promise of punishment. The enslaved were returned to their quarters with warnings sharp as knives, told to remember what waited for those who defied the chain. But in the night whispers still moved. low and careful, speaking not of fear alone but of the woman who had stood tall before her captors. Clara waited for the day without trembling. She rose when the guards called, walked when they ordered, her steps steady, her eyes clear. She did not bow her head. The sun climbed, the bells rang, and the town gathered to witness the end they had demanded. Retribution had come, yet the air carried something deeper, something that could not be silenced with rope or law. The morning of her death broke clear, the sky washed pale blue, the air heavy with heat. The square filled early, men in their coats, women clutching parasols, children perched on shoulders to see above the crowd. Vendors sold sweet cakes, their voices bright as if the day were a fair. Soldiers stood at the edges, muskets at their sides, eyes sharp on the sea of faces. The scaffold rose in the center, tall and stark, the rope dangling loose in the breeze. Clara was led through the crowd in chains, her steps even, her back straight. People leaned forward, whispering, their eyes wide. Some spat at her feet, calling her devil, monster, poisoner. Others stared in silence, uneasy, as though something in her calm unsettled the words in their throats. The children hushed as she passed, their small hands clutching at skirts and sleeves. The sound of her chains clinking against the boards echoed louder than the jeers. She climbed the steps without falter, the sun falling full on her face. The rope swung lightly above her, casting its thin shadow across her chest. The preacher read aloud from his book, calling for repentance, but Clara did not bow her head. She lifted her eyes to the sky, steady, unblinking. When asked if she had last words, she spoke plain, her voice carrying clear across the square. She said they had stolen her children, her blood, her life, and she had taken from them what could never be returned. She said she did not fear their rope, for death was only freedom at last. The crowd shifted, uneasy, the words heavy as stone. The hangman placed the rope around her neck. The hush grew deep, the sound of birds overhead the only voice left. Clara closed her eyes, her lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. When the trap gave way, her body fell, and the breath of the crowd rose as one. The rope snapped taut, swaying in the sunlight, her face calm, her struggle brief. Silence followed, heavy and long. They left her hanging through the afternoon, a warning to all who looked. Children were pulled past with hands covering their eyes, though some peered between fingers. The enslaved from the fields watched from a distance, their faces hidden, their grief carried in silence. When the body was cut down, it was taken to the edge of town, buried without stone, without name. The earth closed over her, but her story would not stay buried. That night in the quarters, voices rose low, carrying songs that had no end. They sang of a woman who stood against her masters, who faced death without fear, who left the world with truth still on her tongue. Her name passed from mouth to mouth, from fire to fire, a whisper at first, then a steady murmur. Children learned it as they learned hymns, carrying it with them as they grew. The story spread beyond the fields, down the river, into towns where strangers spoke of the slave who poisoned her oppressors and met the rope with unbroken will. The masters tried to stamp it out. They called her wicked, cursed, a warning to others. They forbade her name to be spoken, but the more they forbade, the stronger the whisper grew. For every tale told in fear, another rose in secret, shaping her into something larger than life. Some called her a spirit who walked the swamps, her shadow moving through moss and fog, her hand guiding the desperate. Others swore she visited in dreams, her voice calm, her eyes burning like coals, urging them to rise. Years passed, but the story did not fade. Even when the fields changed hands, even when new chains were forged, her memory endured. Clara of Natchez, the woman who turned a supper into a reckoning, who gave back to her masters what they had taken. Her name became a quiet strength, a reminder whispered at night, a spark in the dark. And long after the rope had rotted, after the grave had grown over with weeds, her legend walked on. It lived in the songs sung soft, in the prayers said low, in the courage of those who carried her story forward. The masters built their houses high, but even they could not silence the echo of her name. Clara did not belong to the grave. She belonged to the living, to the ones who remembered, to the ones who still waited for freedom. And so she endured, not as a body bound to earth, but as a legend carried by every voice that dared to speak.